The summer heat lay over the Green River country like a slow-moving animal breathing, shifting, heavy enough to feel across the shoulders. July of 1832 brought mountain men from every stretch of the far west to the big rendezvous. Crow country hunters with their painted robes, long-haired free trappers in buckskins stained by years of smoke and tallow, company men hauling trade goods, and a handful of half-wild newcomers who still looked surprised they weren't dead yet. Tents of white canvas flapped beside willow-fringed banks. Rifles cracked in jovial competitions. Whiskey bad, even by frontier standards, sloshed from tin cups. Horses snorted, men cursed, someone sang an off-key French chanson, and the smell of roasting buffalo hump carried over the camp like a drifting promise of supper. But at one particular fire just to the edge of camp, where the sagebrush gave off its dusty perfume, the evening had gathered around something rarer than whiskey and more entertaining than stories. A man's foolish hope. "Show it again, Elias," boomed Red Kavanagh, a trapper with a beard big enough to hide a quiver of arrows in. "Let the boys see the miracle scrap that's supposed to make him richer than the whole damned American Fur Company." Laughter rippled through the circle. Elias Boone Hardesty, tall, robined, hair, sun-bleached and tied loosely at the nape, reached into the inside pocket of his worn buckskin coat. He moved without embarrassment or bluster. He had endured enough mockery from winters, storms, starving horses, and crow-raiding parties to make these men seem gentle. He withdrew a folded scrap of parchment, brown, brittle, and crumbling at the edges. "A dying man gave it to me," Elias said, voice low but steady. "New Mexican muleteer by the name of Manuel Ortega. He'd been shot with an arrow in the San Juan country, said he was the last of his party. Last fool chasing a ghost, more like," someone muttered. Larpenteur once wrote that mountain men gathered around stories the way wolves circled a carcass, half with hunger, half with amusement. This night matched that image perfectly. Men crouched near, eyes reflecting firelight, expressions dancing between interest and ridicule. Elias unfolded the fragile sheet with near religious care. "Well now," said French Louis, squinting, "ain't that something? Looks like a drunk priest tried to draw a rattlesnake." More laughter. And yet the firelight revealed details that did not belong to drunken fancy. Elias pointed with one long finger. "Here, see that curve? That's a canyon. Rock striations drawn in crossfolds. Red stone," Manuel said, bent inward like book pages caught in the wind. "Rocks don't bend," Red Kavanagh growled. "Not unless the Almighty himself gets bored and starts twisting mountains for sport." "They bend in the Uintas," grumbled old Baptiste. "Seen it with my own eyes. Earth does all kinds o' deviltry." Elias nodded slightly. Manuel claimed the canyon led to a place the Spanish once worked. Said they called it Minas del Cristo Perdido, the lost mines of the Christ in the wilderness. That earned a full roar of laughter now. Men slapped knees, slapped backs, and slapped the ground as if the dirt needed convincing. Lost mines? Hell, every Spaniard who crossed this country had a new lost mine, Red said. Lost gold, lost silver, lost his wits. Only thing they ever found again was Comanches. Elias let the jeers wash over him. Then he knelt, flattening the parchment on a tanned elk hide. What emerged under the flickering firelight had none of the wild, fanciful curls of a tail spinner. The sketch showed angles, measurements, small numbered marks, Jedediah Smith's influence clear as daylight. Elias had copied the original dying muleteer's map into his own journal with Smith-like precision. Elevation notes, bearings based on sun angles, estimated walking distances measured by a trapper's long stride. "See here," Elias said quietly. "Spanish markings your cross draft, directional arrows. This symbol means working face. The canyon bends this way," he traced a line, "yet the river cuts across it at a right angle." "That's unusual." "Unusual means nothing," spit one trapper. "You can see stranger land in the Wind Rivers just by walking 30 minutes in any damn direction." "But there's more," Elias continued. He said the place wasn't just strange. He said it was cursed. Not in the usual priestly fashion. Cursed with memory. That bought a moment of silence. "Memory of what?" Louis asked. Elias met their eyes. of Utes forced to labor there. Spaniards drove them with chains. Some never came out. A low murmur passed through the circle. Even Beckworth wrote of Spanish cruelty in certain early mining ventures. Mountain men were many things, but they understood suffering, and the mention of enslaved Utes cut through the whiskey. Still, most of the circle leaned back with dismissive grunts. Manuel was dying, someone argued. Men see ghosts when blood runs out of 'em. Elias folded the parchment again. The mockery had gentled, but disbelief still ruled the fire. And then, without ceremony, a figure stepped into the edge of the circle. It was Tava, an elderly Ute who had come to the rendezvous with a small trading delegation. His hair hung straight in 2 gray braids, and his face carried the solemn erosion of wind, war, and winters. The fire cast him in a copper glow. He did not ask permission. He simply knelt, slow and creaking, and pointed one long, worn finger at the map. A hush dropped over the men, like a blanket. Tava's voice was soft. "I know this place." Elias felt his heartbeat shift. Tava traced the strange inward-folding canyon with the same reverence a priest gives a relic. "My grandfather told of red cliffs bent like broken wings. River runs wrong. Air smells of rust. Not a place of game, not a place for men." Red Kavanagh cleared his throat. "You saying this fool muleteer didn't lie?" Tava shook his head once. "Place exists." The fire snapped loudly, sending sparks upward. After a long pause, the old Ute rose, but before leaving he said one final sentence, a sentence quiet enough to nearly vanish in the crackling flames. "Some Spanish mines are lost because men hid them. Others are lost because the earth itself wants them forgotten." When he walked off into the shadows, no one laughed. Not a single man around the fire could meet Elias Hardesty's eyes. For the first time since Manuel Ortega died in his arms, Elias saw something shift in their faces, something halfway between fear and respect. And in that moment, he knew. The canyon was real. The map was no myth, and someone would have to follow it. The morning after Tava's quiet declaration, the Green River camp felt different, though no man dared say why. The rendezvous still roared with its usual chaos. Gunshots from target matches echoed across the flats, horses splashed through the shallows, and traders hawked powder and shot with voices like crows. But around the fire, where Elias Boone Hardesty had shown his fragile map, a kind of thoughtful silence had settled. No one mocked him now. Men only watched. Tava sat cross-legged near his small fire, coaxing flame from a handful of brittle willow twigs. Elias approached him with deliberate steps. The old Ute did not look up, but his voice carried across the space between them as if he had sensed him long before he arrived. "You intend to find it," Tava said. Elias lowered himself to the ground. "If it exists." "Yes." Tava's eyes narrowed, creases forming like dry riverbeds across his weathered skin. "Why?" Elias considered lying, saying something practical, something sensible. But truth rode too close behind his teeth. "Because a dying man asked me to finish what he couldn't," Elias said. "Because he believed someone needed to see what the Spanish did. And because I've never shaken the feeling that a canyon like that shouldn't hide itself." Tava let the silence stretch. Then he gave a slow, solemn nod. "Many Utes died there," he murmured. "Some by Spanish hands, some by the earth itself, but I will take you if you listen. I will. And if you do not try to claim the place." Elias held his gaze. "I'm no miner." Satisfied, the old man stood and gathered his few belongings. The decision was made. Tava moved with the quiet conviction of one who understood that certain paths must be walked even when the ground is dangerous beneath the feet. They left the rendezvous with the first streaks of dawn brushing the Wind River peaks in rose-colored light. Elias rode his dun mare, while Tava led a pack-horse, its panniers rattling with dried meat, parfleche bags, and a coil of rawhide rope. The air smelled of dew on sage and cold river water flowing over stones. By midday, they had left the noise of rendezvous behind, trading open meadows for broken ridges where juniper clung in stubborn twists. Their route traced an old Ute trail, one Elias had never ridden, but recognized from Beckworth's descriptions. Sun-bleached stones piled as markers, narrow ledges offering just enough footing for a careful horse, and distant views of red mesas bleeding color into the horizon. Tava spoke little. When he did, it was never wasted breath. "You listen to rivers," he said once, guiding his horse around a fallen cottonwood. "They tell the truth of a canyon better than any man's map." They camped that night in a sheltered hollow where aspens shivered like silver coins in the wind. Elias built a lean-to of branches angled against a downed log while Tava gathered spruce needles for bedding. By the time the moon rose, the fire cast a gentle warmth over them. Elias opened his journal, not the fragile scrap, but his own leather-bound book, worn from years of use. His hand moved slowly, mapping the day's route with careful attention, marking distances in long strides as Jedediah Smith had done before he was killed by Comanches the year prior. Smith had been a stern man, unforgiving, disciplined in his record-keeping. Elias respected that kind of mind. The wilderness killed careless men. Tava watched him write. "You make many marks. Helps me think. Words are weaker than memory," the old man said, "but they last longer." Elias paused, then nodded. "That's why I write them." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Tava's mouth. "Good." Then the smile faded. "You must know," he said quietly, "we are being followed." Elias didn't need to ask how he knew. He had seen Tava glance back more than once. During the day an ear turned, a long pause on a ridge, the way he studied horse tracks in the dust. "Ortega's men," Elias murmured. "They follow the smell of gold," Tava said. "Gold turns men foolish and dangerous." "Yes." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks spiraling upward into the dark like fireflies fleeing the flames. Elias tightened his jaw. He had half expected trouble. A map like his invited it. But he had hoped the wide country might swallow their trail long enough to reach the canyon unseen. "They will wait 2-3 days," Tava continued. "Watch us, learn our direction, then attack? If they believe the map is true, yes." Elias stared into the fire, weighing the impossible truth. He was chasing a myth, and yet a Ute elder had recognized it. He was carrying a map that had nearly gotten a muleteer killed, and now men from Taos shadowed his trail. He had crossed half the West for stories crazier than this. But something about the canyon's folded rock, about the way Manuel Ortega had clutched Elias's coat before dying, whispered of a place that wanted to be found and wanted to remain hidden. Tava tossed a final log onto the fire. "For now," he said, settling into his blanket, "sleep. Tomorrow we walk into older country that remembers." Elias lay back, staring at the stars that hung above them like scattered sparks from the Creator's own forge. The night was quiet, too quiet. The wind barely moved. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Ahead lay a canyon shaped by the impossible, a place where rock bent like paper, a mine lost to time and cruelty, and men following with hunger in their eyes. Elias closed his journal. Morning would come soon enough. They broke camp before first light, moving under a sky the color of cold iron. Elias Boone Hardesty tightened the cinch on his mare and scanned the ridgeline behind them. Nothing moved except the wind curling through the sage, yet the hairs on his forearms prickled. Tava was right, someone followed. The old Ute set a steady pace southward, choosing terrain that forced any pursuer to show themselves. Broken rock fields, narrow saddles between ridges, and slopes too steep for horses to approach quietly. Elias rode with his rifle across his lap, eyes shifting between trail and horizon. By mid-morning they entered a country of twisted piñon and sandstone domes. The air here tasted of dust and juniper, and the earth carried the red hues of the Spanish frontier. Elias had seen such land before down near Taos, where traders whispered of lost missions, abandoned mines, and Spanish expeditions swallowed by the high desert. The muleteer Manuel Ortega had spoken of this place with the same cracked voice in which dying men confess sins. The memory stirred Elias like a cold hand. Tava halted suddenly and raised a fist. Elias froze. The old man didn't look back. He simply tilted his head and listened. 3 heartbeats passed. 4. Then a distant noise drifted across the land, very faint, like a stone dislodging from a boot heel. Elias felt the movement rather than heard it, an unnatural tremor in the stillness. "They are close," Tava whispered. Elias exhaled through his teeth. "We need distance." "No," Tava corrected. "We need to let them show themselves." He led them off the main trail into a shallow draw concealed by brush. There, with practiced hands, they unsaddled the horses and let them crop quietly while they positioned themselves behind a low ridge of stone. Elias loaded his Hawken rifle, the metallic click traveling like a tiny echo through the hollow. Minutes dragged like hours. Then movement appeared, 3 riders, maybe 4, cresting the rise where Elias and Tava had stood less than an hour earlier. Even at a distance, Elias recognized the upright, stiff-backed posture of men from Taos, not trappers. They wore short Spanish-style jackets, broad-brimmed hats, and carried long, smooth-bore muskets. At their head rode Joaquin Ortega, not the muleteer but his kin. Elias whispered, "He's tracking his cousin's map." Tava made no reply. Joaquin Ortega sat his horse like a man accustomed to commanding fear. Broad shoulders, a trimmed black beard, and eyes that swept the country with the hunger of a hawk. He carried a long pistol tucked into a red sash, its silver guard glinting. 4 men followed behind him, lean riders with knives strapped to their leggings and bullets jangling in leather pouches. They halted on the ridge, studying the tracks. Elias pressed lower behind the stone, but Tava didn't move. The old Ute sat as calm as a rock, watching with an unreadable face. After a moment, Joaquin Ortega raised his pistol and fired once into the air. The sound cracked across the land, a sharp, violent punctuation. "He wants you to know he is here," Tava murmured. Elias clenched his jaw. This wasn't a chase, it was a claim. The riders descended toward the abandoned portion of trail where Elias and Tava had left their tracks. They dismounted and studied the ground. Joaquin knelt, running his fingers over the disturbed earth, then lifted his gaze straight toward the ridge behind which they hid. Elias's pulse quickened. "We're too close." "They know direction, not distance," Tava said. "But they will close the gap by nightfall." As the riders remounted and continued south, Elias and Tava packed quickly. The horses sensed the tension, shifting uneasily as Elias cinched their saddles. Tava pointed with his chin toward the broken skyline. "We go into the canyon country. They will follow, but that land chooses sides. And it'll choose ours? Only if we move with respect." They traveled swiftly for the next hours, dropping into a region of narrow chasms and hidden defiles. This was no longer mountain man country, but Ute ancestral ground land shaped by centuries of hunting trails, war parties, and sacred stories. Elias trusted Tava's instincts. The old man navigated the maze with near mystic ease. By late afternoon, when the sun burned low and red against the cliffs, Tava finally slowed. "We camp here," he said, selecting a cave-like overhang protected from wind and view. "But first watch." He placed a hand on Elias's arm and pointed toward a distant canyon mouth. A figure moved there, small at this distance, but unmistakable. One of Joaquin's scouts. He paused at the canyon entrance, studying the ground, then raised his arm in signal. 2 more figures joined him. They huddled briefly, then began searching the rock walls for a path upward. "They'll try to cut us off from above," Elias said. "Yes," Tava answered, "which is why we do not sleep." They built no fire. They ate cold meat and drank river water collected in a buffalo horn. When darkness fell, it swallowed the land completely. No moon rose to soften the edges. Elias took first watch. The canyon breathed cold air, and distant echoes drifted down, faraway shouts, metal striking stone, the muffled clatter of hooves on slick rock. Joaquin's men weren't far, and they weren't giving up. Near midnight, Tava crouched beside Elias. "There is a way to lose them," he whispered, "but it is dangerous." Elias nodded. "Show me." The old man motioned toward a narrow crack in the rock behind their shelter, just wide enough for 1 man, barely wide enough for a horse. "It drops into a hidden ravine," Tava said. "Very steep. We will need rope." Elias reached for the coil of rawhide. Then we climb. Tava's eyes glimmered in the faint starlight. They seek your map, he said. But the land itself is more dangerous than any man from Taos. That's fine, Elias answered softly. I trust the land more. With their horses trembling and the canyon whispering warnings in the wind, Elias Boone Hardesty followed Tava into the darkness, knowing full well that what hunted them were both silver pistols and old Spanish ghosts. The ravine Tava led them into was less a trail and more a wound, carved into the earth, narrow, twisting, and steep enough that the horses trembled with each downward step. Rawhide ropes creaked as Elias steadied the animals, his boots scraping shale that crumbled underfoot. Above them, the night sky dissolved into a thin strip of stars framed by towering cliffs. Tava moved ahead like a shadow that knew the land's secrets. This place hides itself, he whispered. Utes call it Pahiku, the folded red earth. Elias swallowed. Because of the canyon? Because of what happened? The temperature dropped as the ravine deepened, the air turning cold and metallic. Elias smelled the faint scent of rust like old blood on iron. Even the horses hesitated, ears flattening. When dawn crept into the sky, faint light flooded the ravine. Tava raised a hand, halting Elias. Look! They emerged from the crack into a landscape that stole breath. The canyon opened before them, not wide, but impossibly shaped, as if the earth itself had softened and folded like damp parchment. Walls of red sandstone curled inward, bending in sweeping arcs. Bands of stone twisted like frozen waves. Narrow slot canyons split the walls at odd angles, disappearing into darkness. It was exactly as Manuel Ortega had described with his dying breath. Exactly as Elias had sketched from memory. Impossible and yet real. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with dawn wind. Mother of God, Tava nodded slowly. My grandfather's story was true. They led the horses to a shelf of stone overlooking the central canyon. Below, a dry watercourse wound like a white snake through red dust. But it was the markings carved into the canyon walls that caught Elias's eye. Symbols, crosses, chiseled squares. Faded Spanish inscriptions half swallowed by time, a mining sign Mina Vieja, another Entrada Sur, and deeper still Galeria Principal, Spanish, 17th or early 18th century by the style of the lettering. Elias felt his pulse quicken. They really worked this place. Tava's voice dropped low. They forced Utes to dig. Men, boys, even women. They died here. The canyon held its silence like a lingering ghost. Elias tied off the horses and followed Tava along a narrow ledge. They approached the largest opening, a dark maw carved into the stone, framed by rotted timbers blackened with age. The timbers were shaped by an adze, not a modern saw, exactly like those Elias had seen in the ruins of old Spanish missions near Taos. This is older than any trapper's tale, he murmured. And older than any man searching for treasure today, Tava replied. Inside, the air tasted of dust and cold stone. Their footsteps echoed down the abandoned gallery. Elias ran his fingertips along the wall. The striations were smooth, deliberate, hammered by laborers who never chose to be there. He imagined Utmen swinging picks under Spanish lashes, lantern light flickering across their faces. Just beyond a bend, the gallery widened into a chamber. Elias stopped short. Rusted iron rings jutted from the walls, anchor points for chains. A fallen beam lay half buried in the dust. Old hoofprints, burro, maybe mule, had fossilized in hard clay. This is no myth, Elias whispered. Tava knelt beside one old iron ring, touching it as carefully as a man touches a grave. The earth remembers. A sharp crack echoed suddenly, loud enough to jolt both men. Elias spun around. Did you hear? Another crack, then a groan, deep and grinding from somewhere above. Tava motioned sharply. Out, now! The canyon trembled. A slab of stone sheared off the ceiling, smashing into the ground where Elias had stood seconds before. Dust exploded into the air, choking their lungs. They ran, half-blinded, feeling their way to the entrance as more rock thundered behind them. They burst into the open just as another collapse roared through the gallery, sending up a plume of red dust. Breathing hard, Elias leaned against the canyon wall. Was that natural? Tava shook his head. This place is dying. The earth is folding deeper every year. Elias stared into the darkness. Then it should be left alone. Tava's eyes narrowed. You believe that? I do. The old man nodded, satisfied. Then you are not like the others. Elias took a slow breath, steadying himself. The canyon was no treasure. It was a tomb, a memory carved into red stone. Any man seeking gold here would die as surely as those who had dug before. But even as he thought this, the crack of a distant rifle shattered the canyon's silence. Elias and Tava froze. Another rifle shot ricocheted across the folded cliffs. Joaquin Ortega had arrived. Tava grabbed Elias's arm. We must move. The canyon hides us, but it hides them also. Elias's heartbeat surged. The canyon's bending walls would twist sound, disguise direction, and allow ambushes from above or behind. Ortega's men had the high ground. They had numbers, and they wanted the map. Tava led him along a narrow side passage, a twisting corridor carved by ancient floods. The rock glowed red as a furnace in the rising sun. Behind them, the shouts of Ortega's men echoed, distorted by the canyon. Find them! Bring me the map! Dead or alive! Elias gripped his rifle tighter. The canyon had shown him its truth. Now it demanded he survive long enough to carry that truth out. Tava's voice murmured through the stone-walled passage. This place kills the greedy, and it tests the rest. Elias swallowed hard. He had passed the first test, but the next would require more than courage. It would require outwitting men who would kill for a myth, and men who had just learned the myth was real. They escaped the folded canyon by a narrow chimney chute that scraped Elias's knuckles and tore the seams of his buckskin shirt. Tava climbed, with the quiet assurance of a man who'd been navigating rock since childhood, while Elias hauled himself upward with rawhide-wrapped hands, every muscle trembling from the strain. Below them, Ortega's men searched the canyon floor, their curses rising like smoke. By the time Elias and Tava reached the rimrock above the canyon, the sun stood high, burning the valley in red-gold light. Tava scanned their back trail, nostrils flaring like a hunting wolf. We have half a day no more. Elias wiped sweat from his brow. Where do we go? East, Tava answered. Toward the river towns. Ortega fears the law even if he does not fear death. So they rode hard. By dusk they reached gentler ground where cottonwoods clustered along a muddy tributary of the Green. The scent of willows and riverbanks, a scent that belonged to civilization, however thin, washed over Elias like a breath of safety. But safety on the frontier was never more than an illusion. By midday of the next day, they reached a settlement that barely deserved the name, San Gabriel Crossing. A scatter of cabins, a blacksmith's shop made of rough-hewn logs, a trading post, and a makeshift rope bridge spanning a muddy, fast-running river swollen with spring melt. The bridge sagged in the middle like an old mare's back, its rawhide lashings rattling in the wind. That thing looks ready to throw a man into the river, Elias muttered. Tava said nothing, but the grim twist in his mouth said, enough. Locals hurried about with anxious faces, casting worried glances at the bridge and the rising water. When Elias approached, a bearded settler with sleeves rolled to his elbows eyed him suspiciously. Trail's closed, the man grunted. Bridge ain't safe. I can see that, Elias replied. What happened? Flood took half its anchor posts 2 nights ago. The rest'll go any moment. And with Taoist riders spotted near the high trail, folks were packing to flee east, but... The man gestured helplessly at the sagging structure. They can't. Elias felt the problem settle into him with familiar weight. He had lived many lives already, trapper, hunter, guide, interpreter. But before all that, before he'd ridden with Crow warriors or crossed the Tetons in winter, he had been something else. An engineer's apprentice under his father. Before the West had swallowed him whole. He stepped closer to the riverbank, scanning the construction. Cottonwood uprights braced with green wood wedges, rawhide tension straps, cross-grain planks warped from misuse. The bridge wasn't hopeless, it was simply built by men desperate enough to improvise without tools or proper knowledge. It could be fixed. It could even be strengthened. He felt the old instincts flare to life. Elias turned to the bearded settler. "How many men can you spare?" "For what?" "To rebuild it." The settler barked a laugh. "Rebuild? You? You're a mountain man, not a bridge-right." A few nearby townsfolk chuckled. Elias ignored the ridicule. He'd grown thick-skinned long ago. "I know what I'm looking at," Elias said. "If we shore the uprights with angled braces and add tension straps across the span, it'll hold enough weight to get you across." Tava watched with quiet amusement. The fool who chased a map is now chasing a bridge. Elias shot him a look. "I don't chase, I fix." But the settlers weren't convinced. "What do you know about building?" one woman challenged. "Better to pray than to trust rawhide," a man muttered. "I say we abandon the town," another grumbled. Elias stepped closer to the sagging structure. "This is no miracle. It's wood, rawhide, and gravity. And right now, gravity's winning." Tava, ever the bridge between worlds, raised his voice. "This man has crossed more ravines than you have crossed rooms. If he says it can be done, let him work." Silence fell. At last, the bearded settler sighed. "Fine, but if that thing collapses—" "It won't," Elias said. They worked through the afternoon, the sun beating down as Elias directed the townsfolk. Under his guidance, angled braces were cut from green cottonwood saplings. Rawhide straps were soaked to tighten as they dried. Planks were relayed to distribute weight evenly. Uprights were dug deeper and wedged with river stones. The center sag was a tension. Countered with tension, members anchored on the near bank. Men stopped laughing when they saw the precision of his eye. Women brought water and tools without being asked. Children watched him as if he were building the town's salvation with his bare hands. By dusk, Elias crawled under the bridge on a suspended sling, tightening the final strap when a distant sound froze him hoofbeats. Multiple riders. Fast. Tava's voice echoed from the bank. "Elias! They found us!" Ortega's men, 6 of them, riding hard toward the bridge. Elias scrambled out from beneath the structure, mud streaking his arms, rawhide burning his palms. The townsfolk had gathered fear, rising like smoke. Joaquin Ortega reined in his horse just 20 yards away, eyes glinting in the fading light. "You run far for a single scrap of paper," he called, "but you cannot run forever." Elias stepped forward, shoulders squared, sweat drying on his neck. "I'm done running." Ortega smiled coldly, then die standing. Before anyone could blink, thunder cracked above them, dark clouds rolling in, lightning splitting the sky. The river surged, climbing its banks like a living beast. A flash flood. Tava's voice boomed, "To the bridge now!" Elias pointed at the structure he had rebuilt. "Cross it, all of you, go!" Ortega's men hesitated, then realized the rising flood would kill them if they didn't follow. The bridge groaned under the first wave of fleeing townsfolk. Elias felt his heart stop. One failure, one flaw, and they'd all be swept into the churning river. The settlers crossed in panic, clinging to the ropes. Children screamed, horses balked. Rawhide lashed in the wind, but the bridge held. Every creak was a prayer, every shudder was a promise. And Elias Boone Hardesty stood at the near bank, watching the structure he built defy the river, the storm, and God himself, knowing full well Joaquin Ortega was crossing too, pistol drawn, eyes burning with desperation. Elias had no fear left, only purpose. The bridge he built would save the town, but it might also be the place he made his final stand. Lightning tore open the sky as Ortega and his riders reached the bridge, the structure swaying, groaning, and flexing like a living thing fighting the river's fury. The townsfolk had already crossed and gathered on the far bank, soaked with rain, faces pale with terror and awe. Tava stood among them, his hand on the reins of Elias's mare, eyes fixed on the chaos, with the calm of a man who had seen storms break worse men. Elias Boone Hardesty remained on the near bank, boots sinking into river mud as brown water surged higher. Thunder rolled across the valley in long, shaking waves. He could feel the uprights trembling beneath his feet. The bridge would not hold forever. It didn't need to. It only needed to hold long enough. "Move!" Elias shouted, voice drowning beneath the storm. "One at a time. Keep your weight steady." Ortega ignored him. He spurred his horse onto the first planks, splashing water into Elias's face. Behind him, 2 of his men followed. The remaining 3 held back, unwilling to trust rawhide, wet pine, and a mountain man's promises. The horses' hooves pounded across the planks, each impact sending a shiver through the entire span. Rawhide straps tightened as the storm soaked them, pulling the structure into greater tension exactly as Elias had intended, but the force also strained the uprights, dangerously. Ortega locked eyes with him across the rising water. Rain streaked his black beard, lightning reflected in his pistol barrel. "Your bridge is a child's toy," he snarled over the storm. "When it breaks, I will kill you on the rocks below." Elias stepped back, gripping his Hawken rifle. "Then hope it holds long enough for you to reach me." A snarl twisted Ortega's mouth. Halfway across the span, the river exploded upward, a surge of floodwater smashing into the bridge's underside. The structure shook violently. One of Ortega's men screamed as his horse slipped. The animal's hind legs slid between the planks. "Help me!" the man cried, clawing at wet wood. Ortega didn't even look back. Elias did. He leaped onto the bridge's first planks, ignoring the way they sagged under his weight. He braced his shoulder against a support post and reached out, grabbing the trapped rider by his coat. The man's terror-filled eyes widened. Don't. Let go. I'm not," Elias grunted. The horse thrashed, nearly throwing them both into the river. With a desperate heave, Elias hauled the man up just far enough for him to free his legs and scramble onto the planks. The horse was swept away instantly, sucked beneath the churning brown water. The man collapsed on the planks, sobbing with relief. Ortega's other rider glared at Elias with a mixture of confusion and shame. "Why save him?" he shouted over the storm. "Because men shouldn't die for a dead man's map," Elias roared. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the moment, the bridge, the river, Ortega spurring ahead, and Elias gripping the side ropes as rain pounded his face. Behind him, from the far bank, Tava shouted through cupped hands. "Elias! The uprights are lifting!" He didn't need the warning. He could feel it, the bridge's foundation loosening as water scoured the riverbed. Ortega was nearly across. Elias's rescued rider scrambled after him. But the last man hesitated at the far end, staring at the runaway water with terror. "Go!" Elias barked. "Move or die." The man finally urged his horse forward too late. A tree trunk, carried by the flood, slammed into the near upright, splintering it. The entire structure lurched. The world tilted. Rawhide snapped like a gunshot. The bridge sagged dangerously. "Run!" Elias shouted. Ortega reached the far bank and spun around, pistol raised. He shouted something drowned by thunder, but Elias could read his lips. "Give me the map." The man Elias had saved stumbled after his leader, slipping on the rain-slick planks. The final rider urged his mount forward, but the animal balked, sensing death beneath its hooves. Elias had no time to argue. He grabbed the horse's bridle, slapped its flank hard, and shouted. The animal finally leaped forward. But the moment its hooves hit the central span, the collapsed upright tore free entirely. The bridge dropped half a foot. Water smashed through the missing gap. Tava shouted again, voice piercing the storm. "Elias, jump!" Elias grabbed the tension rope, swung out over the river, and hurled himself toward the far bank just as the bridge gave one final, agonizing groan. The planks behind him ripped away. Rawhide snapped in a chain reaction. The entire center collapsed into the river with a deafening crash. Elias slammed onto the far bank, rolling through mud and weeds. Tava grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. Behind them, the bridge, what remained of it, hung twisted and wet, a ruin swaying above the raging torrent. The two men Ortega had led across stood in shock, watching the destruction. Elias met their eyes, one pair filled with guilt, the other with fear. But Ortega's eyes held only hatred. He stalked toward Elias, pistol raised. "You destroyed the map's path, and nearly killed me." Elias rose slowly, chest heaving. "The river nearly killed you. I saved your men. I didn't ask you to." Ortega spat. "I asked for the map." Thunder boomed overhead. "Give it to me," Ortega demanded. "Now." Tava stepped forward, unarmed but unafraid. "Your greed has already killed enough people." Ortega's hand trembled with fury. "Stay out of this, old man." Elias's voice cut through the storm. "The map isn't what you think. It leads to the Spanish silver. It leads to graves," Elias snapped. "It leads to a place that should remain forgotten." Ortega's fury broke like fever. He cocked the pistol. Tava whispered, "Elias." But before Ortega could fire, the ground trembled a low roar as another flood surge struck the broken bridge. The shock wave startled Ortega's horse, which reared violently. Ortega lost his balance, his pistol misfired, his body pitched sideways, and he tumbled down the slick bank into the raging river. His scream vanished instantly. The river took him. No man gold-hungry or otherwise could survive water like that. Silence fell. The remaining riders bowed their heads, then backed away. Unwilling to continue a fight, the canyon, the storm, and the river had already judged. Tava placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "The land chooses who lives," he said softly, "and who it takes back." Elias exhaled shakily, staring at the broken bridge. It had held long enough to save a town, long enough to doom a man. But the story wasn't over. The map still lay in Elias's coat, and the canyon's truth still whispered in his mind. When the storm finally broke, dawn came in pale, washed-out colors, as if the night had scraped pigment from the sky. Mist rose from the swollen river in drifting coils, clinging to the wrecked remains of the bridge like ghostly fingers. The townsfolk of San Gabriel Crossing emerged from their makeshift shelters, blinking, shivering, counting heads. They had survived a night that should have drowned them all. And they owed it to a bridge built by a mountain man everyone said wasn't an engineer. Elias Boone Hardesty stood apart from the crowd, boots sinking into the wet sand as he stared at the place where Joaquin Ortega had disappeared. Only a torn strip of red sash clung to a willow branch, snapping in the morning breeze like a tattered warning. Tava approached quietly. "The river took him," the old Ute said. "And perhaps it is better that way." Elias didn't answer immediately. He had seen death in many forms, warriors cut down in raids, trappers frozen in winter camps, travelers swallowed by avalanches or rivers, but something about Ortega's end gnawed at him. The man's greed had driven him, but greed had not been his only fault. He had carried the pride of a lineage that believed the land existed to be claimed, mined, or conquered. That lineage ended last night. "You saved many people," Tava said, "even some who would have killed you." Elias let out a long breath. That bridge was never meant to last. "No," Tava agreed. "Its purpose was fulfilled. That is enough." Elias turned and looked at the settlers who now gathered around him, men who had doubted him, women who had whispered that he was mad, children who'd thought him a wandering oddity with more scars than sense. Now they approached him with gratitude heavy in their eyes. The bearded settler who'd mocked him at first stepped forward and removed his hat. "Hardesty, if not for you, this whole town would have been wiped out." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "You built that bridge with your own hands," another man said. "Held long enough for all of us," a woman added. "You saved my boy," whispered someone else. Elias shifted uncomfortably. Praise was stranger to him than bullets. "I did what needed doing," he said simply. The murmur grew into applause, awkward at first, then wholehearted. Elias felt heat rise behind his ears. He had survived ambushes, blizzards, starvation, and Ute horse raids, but nothing had prepared him for a frontier town cheering his name. Tava watched with a small smile, the expression of a man who had seen many winters and far more men fail to earn respect. "You do not chase glory," he said softly, "but sometimes it chases you." By mid-morning, the sky cleared. Elias and Tava prepared to leave as blacksmiths and carpenters debated plans for a more permanent bridge. The rescued riders, those who had followed Ortega into the canyon, approached Elias before he saddled his horse. The one he'd pulled from the collapsing span stood with his hat in his trembling hands. "Hardesty," he said quietly, "I owe you my life. I won't forget it." Elias nodded once. "Then don't follow the map anymore." The man swallowed. "We won't. Not after what we saw." They mounted their bedraggled horses and rode south toward Taos, toward whatever life awaited men who had come hunting silver and found ghosts instead. Elias watched them disappear down the trail. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the fragile map, the same brittle parchment Manuel Ortega had pressed into his hands as blood filled the dying man's lungs. The ink had faded further, but the markings remained. The folded canyon, the mines, the Spanish symbols. A path that had consumed the hopes of muleteers, explorers, and killers alike. A path that would continue destroying men if it ever resurfaced. Tava stepped beside him. "What will you do with it?" Elias stared at the parchment for a long, silent moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that some places are meant to stay lost." And before hesitation could creep in, he knelt by the fire pit where a few embers still glowed from the night before. He tore the map into quarters and fed the pieces into the dying coals. The edges curled instantly, flames licking upward. Tava watched with solemn approval. Good. The land will keep its memories, and no more men will bleed for them. Elias nodded, though a part of his mind still traced the canyon's impossible geology, the way the stone bent like pages, the ancient Spanish timbers, the iron rings. Not for treasure, not for greed, but for the puzzle of how earth and time could shape such a thing. A different idea stirred in him. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out his weathered journal, the one filled with neat sketches, tight notes, and precise measurements. Pages he had filled in the canyon, even as dust choked the air and danger pressed on all sides. Drawings of the folded rock, the stress fractures, the cavern chambers shaped by pressure and time. The geometry of the ancient bridge supports inside the mine, and, most notably, the sketch of the canyon's collapsed cliffs, an idea forming in his engineering-trained mind. Tava raised an eyebrow. "You kept notes?" "Not for treasure," Elias said. "For learning. For something else." Tava chuckled softly. "A bridge?" Elias gave a thin smile. "Maybe a better one. Maybe many better ones." The old Ute studied him thoughtfully. "Then perhaps this journey was not for silver or for death. Perhaps the land showed you what it wished you to know." Elias closed his journal. "Maybe so." He mounted his mare. Tava swung onto his own horse with the easy grace of a man who had survived far too much to worry about saddle sores. As they rode out of San Gabriel Crossing, the townsfolk waved, calling out thanks and blessings. Elias lifted a hand in silent reply. He had entered this place with a myth and left it with something far more valuable purpose: bridge building, engineering. Returning to the craft he had abandoned for the wilderness. The canyon had taken gold from men for generations, but from Elias Boone Hardesty it had taken nothing and given back something greater. "Where now?" Tava asked as they reached the high trail. Elias looked east toward the wide plains, where rivers cut the country in 1,000 winding paths. "There are towns that need crossing," he said, "places that need bridges that won't fall." Tava smiled. "Then let us ride." And together, beneath a sky washed clean by storm and judgment, they rode toward a future built not on myth or silver, but on the quiet strength of timber, rawhide, and a mountain man's hand steady enough to hold the weight of a town.